I always think that in any given society, there are kind of angels and there are devils. And then in the middle, you've got kind of the rest of us who are just trying to get by and make society better. But look, I don't think politics and the art of change making is about trying to persuade the not so nice people to be nicer.
Okay.
It's about creating structures in which they aren't given the choice about whether to be nice or not. So we need rules and structures which encourage the best in all of us and discourage the worst. So how do you build a world in which we are all encouraged to be the best version of ourselves rather than the worst?
Jamie Susskind is a distinguished author and barrister renowned for his profound insights at the intersection of technology, politics, and law. As the best-selling author of The Digital Republic and Future Politics, he has delved into how digital technology is reshaping our world. Jamie's legal prowess in areas such as employment and equality law, commercial law and public law, and human rights is marked by glowing recognition in the legal community, where he is described as a rising star with an excellent mind. Jamie's thought-provoking work and thought leadership have made a global impact. His books challenge readers to reconsider the concepts of freedom, equality, power, and democracy in a digitally transformed society, providing critical insights for the future. Let's learn.
I had the extraordinary privilege of being the son of someone who had written books. And so I therefore knew that actually you don't need to be extraordinary to write a book. I saw what it actually took, and what it takes is sitting at your desk and typing. And typing until you've got enough words. And that taught me that writing is a noble and achievable goal.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jamie, for coming down to the School of Social Justice. We're really glad to have you with us to share your wisdom, your knowledge and experience with our students. As I mentioned, our mission is to train the next generation of Martin Luther Kings, and the vision for the school is creating a world where anybody, no matter their background, can learn how to make a difference. So thanks so much for joining us today, and can't wait to share kind of what you've learned, particularly because I've known you for a while. I think we probably met in 2014, so
nearly a decade.
Yeah, nearly a decade, 10 years. It's been a great to see your career from, being a lawyer, then writing a couple of books, which have really challenged the way people think about our world today in the digital world we live in. And just in terms of your legal work as well as your writing, there's so much we can learn from your kind of methods of change. But first off, it'll be great to learn a bit about yourself and kind of what you do.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I've seen some of the other guests you've got along on this series, and I feel pretty humbled to be in their company. I'm Jamie. I'm from North London, from the Hertfordshire area. I practice by day as a barrister in the courts of England and Wales. And by night, I'm a kind of author, writer, speaker, agitator, mainly related to digital technology and the way that it's changing our lives.
Amazing. And kind of what do you, given all of those roles you play, I was imagining you also in the afternoons being like a superhero or something, but in all those roles, how do you perceive social justice, particularly in a world right now where we're facing a lot of challenges when it comes to issues around racism, sexism, environmental damage, human rights abuses? For us at the school, we really focus on how we can make the world fairer and more just. What does social justice mean to you?
I think it has three kind of levels. Okay. There's a basic level, which is that I want to live in a society where everyone, every single person, has a good level of security, dignity, health and well-being. So there just should be a baseline below which no one falls. Then on top of that, I want to build a society where everyone has an equal chance to live a life that is full and meaningful. And what you find full and meaningful might be different from what I find full and meaningful. And indeed, having the freedom to choose your conception of the good life is part of that vision as well. So you've got the kind of baseline level of security, safety, dignity. On top of that, you've got the chance to live a meaningful and full life. There's a third element which is really important to me as well, and it's about power.
Okay.
I want to live in a society where it can't be said that any group or institution or person is able to dominate or bully or have unaccountable power over another group. So, for example, I don't want to live in a society where men can dominate women, in a society where bosses can dominate workers, where one racial or ethnic group can dominate another racial or ethnic group. So for me, the pursuit of social justice is about, as well as the first two things I described, creating systems of accountability that mean that no one in society is capable of exerting too much unaccountable power over anyone else. Linking that back to my own work, my great fear is that in this century, we're seeing a world develop where some people are able to exercise unaccountable power over others because they own and control powerful technologies. And that's something that I've focused on in particular. But as a barrister, you know, I practice as a discrimination lawyer.
That's interesting. I look forward to kind of hearing a bit about your cases when you talk about kind of the methods of change and examples that you've seen worked for making a difference. I'm curious about why you believe we need to create this world of social justice that you've just described, particularly people, you know, in power. Why should they care about other people who are not in power, particularly of those who have the view that, you know, we live in a Darwinist world, people should focus on themselves, focus internally, particularly when we're going through an economic downturn. You know, it's all about ourselves. I mean, what do you say to those people who kind of say, what's the point of trying to address social injustice?
Well, look, I think in every society, there have been and always will be a certain number of people who are just in it for themselves. I always think that in any given society, there are kind of angels and there are devils. We all know some people who are just unaccountably nice the whole time, the most benevolent, charitable, kind, generous. Maybe they were born that way, maybe they were brought up that way, I don't know. Let's say a fifth of the population are angels. I think a fifth of the population are probably the opposite of angels. They're not very nice. I think a fifth of the population probably hold views that are, I'm not saying it's the same fifth every time. I think it changes, but you know, take a horrible view. I think a fifth of the population will probably hold it. And then in the middle, you've got kind of the rest of us who are just trying to get by and make society better. But look, I don't think politics and the art of change making is about trying to persuade the not so nice people to be nicer. It's about creating structures in which they aren't given the choice about whether to be nice or not. So in the workplace, for instance, I don't believe that, you know, a system in which you just hope that your boss is going to be wise and kind and good is not a good system, even if your boss at that point happens to be wise and good. What you need to have are laws and regulations and structures that make people behave in a way that is socially acceptable. And so in any situation, be it in the workplace, be it in the institution of marriage, be it in our political institutions, we need rules and structures which encourage the best in all of us and discourage the worst, and encourage the best of us and discourage the worst. We have to accept that humans are flawed and messy. And by the way, in my kind of silly angels and devils analysis, I'd go further and I'd say that kind of in all of us, there is good and bad. I think everyone we know is capable of doing great things and capable of doing terrible things. So how do you build a world in which we are all encouraged to be the best version of ourselves rather than the worst?
It's a big question. And I guess there's so many means through which we can try and achieve that system and that ecosystem where we enable that. I mean, for you, you talked about being from North London, also being a lawyer, working on discrimination cases, writing books about how we can create a fairer world given the powers that may be kind of coalescing around certain companies and individuals in this new age. Why have you taken this pathway, particularly for the students who are kind of like figuring out what they want to do with their lives, you know, and seeing people on TikTok saying, here's how you become a crypto billionaire, or here's how you become a consultant in one of the big four. Fine, that's all good. But I mean, for you as somebody who's trying to play a part in addressing some of the big problems facing our societies, like, why did you personally get involved?
It's a really good question. And I should, just be really honest. There are times when it doesn't feel worth it. There are times where it feels too difficult. There are times where you feel you should just be trying to make a bit of money and live in comfort and kind of look out for you and yours. But there are other times where I feel inspired, angry, passionate, and I try to have more of the latter than the former in my life. I mean, without getting too psychological about it, you ask yourself, where do you come from?
Yeah.
What motivates you? What made you you? I think there are a few important things in my life. One is that I'm the grandson of a refugee. He died not so long ago, but my grandfather came here as a refugee from Nazi Germany. This was the country that gave him asylum when the rest of his family was murdered. What does that give you as his grandson? It gives me a great loyalty to the country, a great love of the country, a great sense of affinity with those who come here seeking that kind of protection. Even though, of course, I grew up in comfort, privilege even, and I had the benefit of a great education. But probably more important than all of that is my parents, they brought me up to believe that if you're given a lot in life, you should give back. That's just something that they sort of taught me. They taught me that a meaningful life is not measured by how much you have, but by what you do and who you are. That's a lesson that I try to remember a lot. My mum was a nurse. My dad is a kind of professor, teacher, thinker, consultant. He also thinks about the future, very inspiring.
Yeah, I've seen him speak many times. He's definitely a role model. And I remember being at the Law Society with you and him giving speeches. So yeah, very interesting to hear about the influence he had on you as a kid and now as a man. So you were about to say something.
Well, I should say, and to your listeners, I've written books, right? And a lot of people often say to me, wow, that's kind of, you've written books. And it's something that a lot of people would consider to be a completely kind of unobtainable objective. I had the extraordinary privilege of being the son of someone who had written books. And so I therefore knew that actually you don't need to be extraordinary to write a book. I mean, my dad is extraordinary. But I saw what it actually took, and what it takes is sitting at your desk and typing and typing until you've got enough words. And seeing that from a young age, a lot of people are inspired by their parents and what they do. But, my dad wrote and still writes, and that taught me that writing is a noble and achievable goal. So, all of this is to answer your question, why do I do what I do? By the age of 18, my identity was formed in a way that made me want to live a life that was more than just making dough. I don't deprecate anyone who wants to do that, but I don't think it's enough to live a rounded and meaningful life.
What's interesting there is because I do, when speaking to leaders from many different backgrounds, this idea of not wanting to make a lot of money, because of course when people decide what kind of job they want to do, often in the non-profit sector, you're not necessarily going to get huge wages. What do you say to people who are worried about that aspect of it? I mean, I don't think you've worked for a charity before, but just in terms of the difficulties you might face in that world compared to elsewhere.
Do you know what, Alvin, I'll be really honest, I'm probably not the person to ask that, because as a barrister, I earn well,
Okay.
So there's no kind of getting around that fact, and it's not something that I'm embarrassed about. By the way, I would say to the people listening, there's nothing wrong with wanting to look after yourself and your family. I think a lot of people who want to make a bit of money, it's not just so they can have a Maserati or even a really nice flat or house. It's so they can look after their mum and dad, or look after their sister, or be comfortable, or know that if there was a crisis, they would be able to pay for the taxi to the hospital or whatever it is. And so I'm never going to say that it's something that people shouldn't look out for. And also it is just something that people want to do. And so you just have to accept that as a fact of life. What I try to aim for in my life is a balance. So I do a fair number of cases pro bono, for instance.
Okay.
That means I don't get paid for them and I get to choose, worthy causes. And the reason I'm able to do that is because, I do other cases where I am paid and that enables me to do it. But, I wouldn't claim to be someone who had given up the prospect of earning well in order to make difference. I'm actually trying to do both, and I don't apologize for it.
I think that's a great response, just in terms of being able to do both. And I'm curious now, turning to like methods of change. You talked passionately about some of the reasons why you do what you do. Curious to know a bit more about what you actually do.
Yeah.
And kind of some of the social injustices you've seen and how you've approached them in tackling them. What comes to the forefront is this want to write and to put thoughts into writing and to give public talks about the things you write about, doing conversations like these as well, plus kind of the work you do as a lawyer, like being in the courts and making arguments. Tell us a bit about what you perceive to be the methods of change that you've employed.
Well, let me again start by saying, compared to some of the other guests you have on this show, I wouldn't claim to be a great change maker. I do try to contribute, and I try in a very specific way. And to explain that, let's kind of start at the end. What are the barriers to achieving a better society? What are the barriers to achieving social justice? Well, some of them are political, some of them are economic, some of them are legal, and I'm not trying to solve all of those. But I do think that one of the barriers in the field that I write about, one of the barriers to change is a kind of lack of clarity and lack of understanding. So let me put it this way. I'm not sure that we as a society have woken up yet to the extraordinary challenges that digital technology are going to pose for the future, the extraordinary challenges that it's going to pose for freedom, for democracy, for justice. And until we have that level of intellectual clarity and understanding, all of that other stuff, trying to change the law, trying to change politics, trying to change society, is never going to happen. And if you try to start at the end, you'll end up muddled and confused and in a big mess. So I've got one modest task, which is to try to help my readers think clearly and powerfully about the challenges of digital technology, which, by the way, I think are some of the greatest challenges our generation faces, up there with climate change, challenges and opportunities. So that's my modest contribution in my writing, is that I try to get people to think more clearly and to think for themselves. Writing books and giving talks and giving interviews and stuff is, that's one way of doing it. I'm sure other people would have other ways as well. In the law, it's slightly different.
Before the law bit, I'm really curious to dig into a bit of that, because what it is a method of learning and understanding, and seeking that clarity in order to base your action on fact. Can you tell us a bit more about your process, I guess in this case of writing, but also uncovering these truths of which you write about? Kind of give a sense of your craft and how you do it. You mentioned your dad sitting and just typing. I mean, what is your process for getting to the point of clarity?
It's a great question. And I should say the typing comes right at the end.
Okay.
Before you do that, you've got months or years of reading and thinking. And it's quite hard to describe exactly how it works, because it's not always a kind of formal process. A lot of my best ideas are ideas I think of when I'm standing on the tube or in the shower, and I get out and I jot them down in my phone. And then eventually, after 6 months, 12 months, they coalesce into a kind of coherent set of thoughts, which are ready to be put into words. But before you even get to any of that stage, you've got to do your homework. What does that mean? It means gathering and digesting, for me, very large amounts of primary research material.
Okay.
So I read what's in the journals. I read what's in the latest textbooks and books. And what I try to do is use the learning that great scholars and academics are producing for actually quite a limited academic audience. And I try to help bring some of that out in my books, footnoting it all, of course, but in a way that the rest of us can understand. So what's the process? The process is you start with an idea or an aim. I want to do X. Then you try to gather all of the books and information that are relevant to it and you read them.
Okay.
And then you, as you're going along, you think about, well, do I agree with this? Do I disagree with that? Is there something I could add? Is there something I could change? My dad once, he told me about a kind of interesting way of looking at the world, which is based in an anecdote from Henry Ford.
Okay.
Henry Ford was a horrible person, so
Okay.
you just caveat that. He's a terrible guy. But he was the guy who brought the car to the mass market, hence Ford cars. Nasty guy, hated Jews, but obviously quite smart, good at business. And one thing he used to say was, if I'd asked people what they'd wanted, they would have told me they wanted faster horses. And I quite often use that. I think about that when I'm reading other people's work. I ask, is this person a faster horses person? Are they imagining a future that is the same as today, but just a little bit faster, a little bit slicker? Or can we imagine a future that's as different from today as the car was from the horse that preceded it? And sometimes the future is faster horses, but sometimes it's car. And one of the things I always try to do in my mind is differentiate.
Really fascinating to hear kind of your process, and also just seeing you live, gather your thoughts and think about how to articulate what, as you described, is a years-long process. I think what's really fascinating, particularly with innovation and new ideas, is that they often come from a place of standing still or the doing of nothingness. You mentioned shower, you mentioned standing on a train. Often what is perceived to be not working actually is sometimes one of the most creative moments within a day. So I think I agree. That's definitely where I find when I'm brushing my teeth, when I'm not thinking, and just the synapses in the brain just tend to make connections, which if you're thinking about what next to do or looking at your checklist or calendar or speaking to people very actively without having your brain, giving your brain some space to just be, I find you lose creativity. But when you just let it free, those ideas come up. But I think what's really fascinating also is this, your deep dive into material, which is, as you say, often not read, but still so full of value because of the kind of methodologies, researchers that academic institutions employ. I mean, for people who are kind of maybe, oh, damn, like they might think 10 years, decades, years of work. I mean, what do you say to people who are just entering that world to kind of give them a sense of the reality of what it takes?
Well, I mean, again, I want to say what I said a minute ago about writing. It was about writing books, but it's actually about writing generally. Some people might find it more rewarding to write articles or to write blogs or a newsletter, whatever it is. Don't be afraid of it. Where my first book came from was that I was sitting at university studying politics. And I remember it was in kind of 2009. And at that time, smartphones were just about to come out, and Facebook had been a thing for a couple of years, and the internet was already a pretty big thing, huge. It was clear to me, as it was to anyone else in the world, that digital technology was changing the way that we live together, and that was likely to have consequences for politics and society. And yet, I looked at my reading list for my politics degree, and where was this stuff? Nowhere. Not just because you're studying classic books from, 20, 30 years ago. Great, you've got to do that. But also because there wasn't really an industry of people writing about the political implications of digital technology. And even I, as a kind of 18-year-old, could see that was obviously a mistake. It was obviously a gap. And it made me want to do something about it. Add that to what I described earlier, which was a sense of the possible with writing, a sense that writing was a noble and achievable task. And I thought, you know what, I will try and write a book. Did take me 8 years to come out with the first one. So I'm not saying, because, I had to go out and get a job and pay the rent. And I did a lot of tutoring to pay through law school. And I went to law school and got my pupillage, etc. But, I got there in the end. I would say as well that my legal practice has been really useful for my writing, because seeing the law at the kind of sharp end does make you think carefully about what laws could look like. So what I would say to your listeners is, every one of us has kind of unique experiences, whether they're life experiences, or maybe there's someone unusual in your family. Maybe you have a difficult parent who you're used to dealing with, or maybe you have a friend who's unusual, or maybe you have a teacher at school who's inspiring, or maybe there's been a situation in a sports team that you've been part of. Whatever it is, we all have these unique experiences. Draw on those. Draw on the wisdom that you've gained in your life and try to use it to impart, wisdom to other people, and maybe there's something there.
For sure. I'm just going to quickly check the time. We've got 25 minutes, which is perfect. One last question on writing. I often find that I don't know what I think until I write. So I use the writing process and typing and just getting a piece of pen and paper to understand what I think about an issue. Part of the practicalities of living in a digital world is often we remove ourselves from writing and think of it as a kind of old practice, something we don't do anymore. Rather, we scroll and we kind of like. For you, and final comment for listeners on writing, how do you use writing more generally, aside from kind of books? Do you scribble things down, like very practically speaking, when on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I wouldn't want to give a misleading impression, and you've made an incredibly important point, which is that it's not like when I sit down to write in the morning, I kind of have this sort of blueprint in my brain, and all I need to do is type it out. In fact, the days where I think I know what I really want to say are the days where I feel least motivated, because it's like a feeling of regurgitation. It's boring. What instead mostly writing is a process of exploration.
Okay.
You have some ideas, some intuition, some arguments, and you put them down on a page. And one thing that I think is really cool about living in the 21st century is that when you write, you use a word processor, or at least I do. I don't write by hand. And the process of word processing on a screen using like Microsoft Word or something is that you can move stuff around. You can delete, you can edit, you can remix, you can reshape. And that process is as important as the process of splurging. So to be really specific about it, what I will tend to do if I'm trying to produce a book is I will do what my friend Matt describes as a vomit draft. I vomit up my thoughts, often they're kind of incoherent and not very well organized. Go and take a walk, have lunch, have a shower, come back to it. Start to rearrange, start to rebuild, sanding, polishing, moving, deleting, adding. And then by the end of the day, I might have something that's worthwhile. Not much, the most I really hope to produce book-wise a day is 1,000 words, which isn't a huge amount of text. But, you do that 30 days in a row, you've got yourself a short book. That's a month. So I'm not a great one for handwriting stuff. The last time I wrote a lot by hand at length was when I was at university a decade ago. Longer than that, actually, 13 years ago. I do a lot of typing. I take a lot of notes on my iPhone when they sort of occur to me, and then I'll email them to myself and transplant them into my documents and use them as the basis for my writing.
I mean, really kind of open, revealing stuff just in terms of your day-to-day practice, but also I think a message of hope for aspiring writers, given this very clear sense of 1,000 words a day. Just get it out. It doesn't really matter that it's not perfect, because there's an opportunity to redraft and polish. And I'm sure, given the fact that so many people want to make a difference here, and look into historic examples of writers who have changed the world through words. I mean, it's amazing the power of words on a piece of paper. For people who want to develop the craft of writing, that was a really helpful kind of detailing of your process. To now talk a bit more about your legal practice. You talked about how being a lawyer means that you're with people all the time. You're seeing the kinds of things that are impacting everyday people. Tell us a bit about what it means to be a lawyer and barrister, particularly for people who are considering becoming a lawyer, solicitor, barrister, to achieve change.
So being a barrister means that I'm the kind of lawyer that represents people in court. So my job is to do written and oral advocacy, documents for the court and speaking in court, which might mean making submissions, making arguments, and it might mean cross-examining. Barristers are a little bit, if you think about a medicine analogy, barristers are a little bit like a surgeon. You go to a solicitor who has a very broad or a broader understanding of the law, and they will often advise you and often they will fix your problem for you. But if something more specialized is needed, and indeed you're going to court, the solicitor will bring in a barrister, like in the same way that a GP might bring in a consultant or a surgeon. And so I spend my days acting for clients. I have a duty to represent them fearlessly and to the best of my abilities. Your listeners may not know this, but barristers are subject to what's called the CAD rank rule. The CAD rank rule means that you're not allowed to turn down cases on the basis that you don't like or agree with the client.
Wait, so anybody can come up to you and say, I need you as my barrister, and you can't say no?
As long as it is within your professional competence, something you know about, it's suitable for you, so it's not something that someone more senior should be doing, and they're prepared to pay your fees, whatever they happen to be. Yes, and you've got the time to do it. You are under an ethical obligation to accept that work. So when work comes in the door to me, I don't, and this might surprise some of your listeners, it's not really my job. It's not my job at all to kind of apply my moral considerations. I mean, obviously I often, I have my own views about the merits of a case, but I will normally share those views with my client. It's my job to tell my client, you have a good case, you have a bad case. But my job is to act as fearlessly and as well for both those clients equally. There's a kind of nuance here, which is that some barristers and some barristers' chambers develop a reputation for acting for one kind of path. So, there are some chambers you just wouldn't go to get a barrister to act for an employer rather than an employee in an employment dispute. There are some chambers where if you go there, they really only have a reputation for acting for employees. Some of those, likewise, there are barristers who will sue the government, but will not sue the government.
Got it.
And that's because they have a reputation. It's because no one's trying to instruct them to act for the government. But if someone did come to them and ask them to do it, the government's a bad example because you have to be on a particular panel. But if someone did come to them with a case which they didn't like ethically, but all of those conditions were satisfied, they would have to act for them.
That's something definitely new to me. I'd not learned about that. And it's one of those things which is an example of how complex and complicated the legal system seems to ordinary folk, and exactly why we need lawyers with specialisms like yourself. I mean, for you, what are the characteristics that make a great lawyer? Because I think, we see in the general public, kind of popular TV shows like Suits. We've got former famous leaders who have practiced as barristers, as solicitors. Some of the great campaigners started off their careers as lawyers. Gandhi, I think Mandela. There's a whole bunch of people who learnt the craft of being a lawyer. And as you kind of pointed to and alluded to earlier, if your job later is to create laws and to, build legislative agendas which speak for a nation or a country, having that experience and knowledge can be helpful. So whether or not people decide to be a lawyer or not, there's many things we can learn from the legal profession and barristers like yourself. I mean, what makes a great barrister?
Well, some people would say, by the way, the lawyers don't make good politicians, or that they should, there are too many lawyers in or around politics. I sometimes I kind of understand that view, but I accept your general premise that if you look at politics, you find a hell of a lot of lawyers. Keir Starmer, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton. You just think of a lot of leading political figures, and they started off as lawyers. I guess a lot of people are interested in law are interested in politics as well. Separate question, what makes a good lawyer? I can tell you about.
Well, just before that, why do you think that is? So one of the interesting kind of facts that I learned was that a significant number of British prime ministers between the late 19th century and Second World War had lost a parent when they were young. So very interesting about the psychology of what makes a political leader. What is it about the law, aside from the dimension of kind of the links between, creating legislation and the craft of being a lawyer? Why were Barack Obama? I mean, was this a decision they made early on because of this understanding that it helps you become a better political leader? I mean, can you talk a bit more about the links between politics and the legal profession, particularly for people who want to become politicians?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who want to become politicians become lawyers as a kind of potential stepping stone. I think there are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, if politics doesn't work out, it's a great career to fall back on. Secondly, in the States, there is actually a closer relationship between law and politics. So if you think about Bill Clinton, for instance, he was elected. They elect their attorney generals in America. So the attorney general is the most senior lawyer in a state. That's both a lawyer and a politics role. And then he used that to become governor, and then became governor. And after he became governor, he became president. So it's quite clear. I mean, Obama actually used to get a bit of flack as being the professor president, as a guy who was too much like a law professor and not enough like a politician. Why do lawyers become politicians? Well, look, they're interested in laws, the making, the content of those laws. They tend to be interested in wider political and social issues. It tends to give them a kind of stable professional background to use as a kind of trampoline into politics, but also as a mattress if they fall. The skills that you learn as a lawyer are useful skills in politics, but only up to a certain extent. So let me give you an example. What you're taught to do as a lawyer, you're taught to pay attention to the detail. You're taught to have and expected to have total integrity and honesty. I know that's not what people associate with lawyers, but that is what's expected of us. You are expected to have highly developed analytical skills. You're expected to have powerful communication skills. But just thinking about the reality, often if you describe a politician as lawyerly, you're not being complimentary about them. They might be someone who's better at articulating details than a vision, who's better at explaining than inspiring, who's better at kind of getting down in the weeds than looking at the big picture. So, I think there are some ways actually that being a lawyer might inhibit being a politician. Tony Blair's quite interesting in this. In his autobiography, he talks about the transition from being a lawyer to being a politician. And he talks about having to shed some of the skills, but retaining others, retaining the power of analysis, the power of expression, shedding some of the obsession with minutiae and details. But I think that's probably the same with all careers. I'm sure all careers prepare you for politics in some way and don't prepare you in some other way. A social worker will be a great politician in some ways because they understand the world as they've seen it as a social worker, but they may not have had to develop certain other skills that a lawyer might have developed. Likewise, a doctor, likewise a trade union organizer, whatever it is. That's why you want a diversity of people.
For sure. And I just really like the way you described what you're taught to do as a lawyer and all the things you need to be a competent lawyer. What would you say to folk who want to kind of develop their own skills? Kind of what kind of skills do you think they need as an individual? Moving away from just lawyer now, but just in general, wanting to make a difference. What kind of skills do you think people need to develop themselves individually?
That's a really good question. I suppose what are the skills that have served me best in life? One is listening. Not something I was naturally good at as a kid, but I learned, and now I love listening and learn a lot from it. And
why did that change? Was there a moment where you're like...
It was holding me back. It was holding me back in my relationships, it was holding me back at work. You can't be good at anything in life unless you're listening. That's one of the kind of lessons that I've learned. These are things I learned reasonably young. I'm like everyone. I like to have my say, but at least I now have the ability to kind of remember that listening's super important, whether it's with a friend or whether it's with a colleague or in a court. You can't just be waiting to speak. You've got to be listening.
Like the audience now.
You wouldn't get the sense from this impression from this that I'm a listener rather than a speaker, because I'm having to do all the talking. I think maybe the other thing I would say is an underrated quality is clarity.
You mentioned this before. So why is clarity so important?
Unless you can make yourself... Let me start by telling you a bugbear of mine.
Go on. Yeah.
It's a bugbear that you find in academia, in my writing life, and in the law. And it's people who say things in a complicated way when a straightforward way would do. I'm not saying you shouldn't aspire to speak elegantly and nicely and eloquently, but don't use a long word where a short one would do. Don't use 100 words where 50 would do. When you're speaking, you're trying to make the person who's listening to you feel educated, not make yourself look grand and smart. And I read so many academic books where it's just like pompous rubbish that, I read it and I can't understand it. I think, who's this written for?
Yeah.
I listen to lawyers sometimes with their flowery language, and I think you're not persuading anyone. You're just enjoying the sound of your own voice. Politicians too. So with clarity, when I talk about clarity, I mean the key thing whenever you're speaking or writing is to try and make yourself understood.
Yeah. Great point, particularly in writing, just general communication, and that applies to all parts of life. And you just reminded me of all of those papers I used to read as a student at SOAS. Just thinking, what are these people trying to say? I remember writing an essay, just kind of criticizing that whole machinery, which kind of praises that kind of language, whereas I can't remember who said it, and it's often a quote kind of given to many other people, but the idea that excuse me for the long note, I didn't have enough time to make it short. And so really important point around clarity. Look, your first book you ever wrote was Future Politics, and it talked about the future of our politics in this changing world. And of course, you've got a second book out, and we will make sure to send links. You have to read it. Big tomes. I remember being at the book launch for Future Politics, and I think the editor said, I can't remember specifically word for word, but he said this was he said it was the best book he had worked on. I think I remember hearing him say, and then for you to have now released the second book is amazing. But for people who want to be involved in this future politics and in shaping a world which is fair, where social justice is able to achieved for each generation, what advice or tips do you have for those people who are aspiring to make a difference in whatever they so choose to do in their life and career?
Okay, so let me first of all break with what a lot of people in this area say.
Okay.
A lot of people who are concerned about digital technology, what they have is lots of advice for us as individuals, like hygiene rules about how your password security, your data and how you use it, what you do and do not reveal of yourself on the internet. That stuff is all important, and it's a matter of personal ethics, and you have to pay attention to it. But the great challenges of digital technology are not going to be fixed by us acting as individuals. It's a little bit like before trade unions existed. One worker might say, I've had it, I'm out of here. But if 1,000 workers were waiting at the factory gates to take their job, and there were 1,000 more already working the shop floor, that made no difference. What made a difference was when the workers together said, we won't stand for this. So you might think that Facebook is unethical and get off it. Facebook doesn't care. Facebook has more members than Christianity does. So a lot of the solutions that I identify in the digital republic are collective solutions. They're about what we can do together rather than what you're told as an individual you should be doing. The world isn't on our shoulders as individuals, it's on our collective shoulders. What does this mean in practice? It means we need to change laws. We need new laws, we need new regulations, we need new institutions. How do you get that? You get that through political activism, political awareness, participating in political causes you care about, running for office, getting elected and changing the law. So straightforward and as difficult as that. And I don't shrink from it. I don't think, for instance, if you look at the great social challenges and opportunities posed by social media, I don't think you harness those without government action of some kind. And so I want your listeners to be political. I want them to look at digital technology and ask, not just where can I get that? How much does it cost? As we're all accustomed to asking as consumers, but to look at it as citizens, to look at the technologies around you and ask, how's this affecting our democracy? How's this affecting the way that we interact with each other? Is this making me more or less free? Is this making society more or less just? And orienting a different worldview around it. It's a little bit like climate change 15 or 20 years ago. People kind of vaguely had this idea that it was an important issue and it would become more important. That's what I'm trying to move digital technology up the political agenda as one of the great issues of our time. And what I hope that your listeners will do is start to think like citizens and not just consumers when it comes to digital tech.
Wonderful. That's a big challenge to everyone watching, to really consider their role and what they and how they play a part in responding to all these great changes you talk about. I'm just aware of time. I've got one last question, I guess. Back in 2014, when we met through the Global Shapers, you had actually started to articulate this idea, which is for me one of the lessons or reflections I want to share with people who are watching and listening. Because you had been developing this thought back in, 9 years ago. And you were in conversation with people. I remember being in a room, me, you, Matt Clifford, from Entrepreneur First, another fellow shaper, and his job being to develop future startup tech leaders. And then you kind of responding about how is this going to impact us from an intellectual point of view, but also very practically, and what kind of laws need to change. I think one reflection there is that you get the crystallization of thoughts and clarity through lots of conversations as well, and being surrounded by smart people. And part of my hope with the School of Social Justice and our hope with the team was to enable folk from all walks of life to hear these kinds of conversations that we've just had now. Just in terms of the future, of course, as I mentioned before, your first book is called Future Politics. As a final question, where is our world heading to, and what do the next generation of social justice leaders need to consider as that one thing that they need to consider when leaving this conversation? You've kind of talked about just generally them having to think about these digital changes, but what's the one thing you want to leave with them before we go?
Well, firstly, you've exploded another myth of being a writer, which is that it's a kind of job you do on your own. It's not. It takes countless conversations and discussions with friends and colleagues. So have those conversations and discussions, even if they seem silly at the time, just do it. And who knows, you'll be taking notes in your iPhone that might later form something really, really useful. I don't know if I have one lesson for your listeners, but I do have one sort of slightly corny one, which is that if you try, you got to have this balance between being inspired by your heroes and not just trying to be them, because you're not them. You're in some ways worse than them, and in some ways better, but in all ways different.
Go on,
I think you're a bit like me. I've got heroes. I've got these people who I look up to and think, wow, they're great. But as I've grown older, I've sort of realized that I'm not, and I'm never going to be them. But that's also kind of liberating, because I'm me and I've got my own stuff. So I guess what I'm saying is really corny. Be yourself. Find the thing that makes you. And then that in turn will inspire other people. I'm pretty sure that's right. I don't think you can live a great life unless you're, and that's what we're all aspiring to, living a great life, unless you're actually living your life rather than trying to repeat someone else's.
I love that. I love that because, as a part of our communication, we want to get the idea of what the school is trying to do by saying we want to train the next generation of Martin Luther Kings. But not everybody needs to be like Martin Luther King. He is personally one of my heroes. You mentioned Barack Obama previously. He inspired me to become a community organizer. Jose Rizal, the Filipino national leader, who really taught me how to take on fearlessly, to use your word, and courageously the powers that be, despite your own safety potentially being threatened. I think there's definitely things we can learn from them, but what a great message to leave our listeners. It's the first time I think someone's expressed that kind of idea, but it's really important, particularly given that we can't be other people, and we've got to embrace ourselves. I did have one final question, because you're such a thinker. And this is maybe a big question to end on. I mean, how do you think? So the intellectual process of thinking, you know, as I say, you know, you talked about writing and figuring out what you think by writing, as well as through conversations. But do you have any final words on your process of thinking? How did you learn how to think? I mean, it's a very philosophical kind of meta question, but I'm curious. And you're doing it now, which is,
Well, I don't know how good an answer I can provide to that. There's a really great book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, a social psychologist. And he basically explains that there are two different ways of thinking, which all of us do. One is like intuitive thinking, almost automatic thinking, the kind of thinking that takes place often without you even realizing. Like when you walk or when you drive a car, you're not consciously thinking about how to do all of those things. And then there's a different type of thinking, which is a sort of slower applied thinking, like when someone gives you a difficult maths problem, you have to say, right, okay, hold on, I'm really going to apply my mind to that. And I guess a lot of the time what I'm trying to do in life is move from the second type of thinking to the first type of thinking. And the way you do that is by experience. So the way that you get intuition, and I'm really thinking about my legal profession here, because often when people come to you, what they want is they want you to be able to say, look, I've seen this before, or I've seen something like this before, and here's how I think it's going to play out. And there's something even deeper than that as a lawyer. When you get a case and you open it, and you've just got a gut feeling that this is not going to go down well, or that this is going to go well. And where that comes from is experience and learning, as much as from like analysis and thinking. So a lot of, I think, thinking is actually about doing and learning and experiencing, rather than just reading and kind of being logical. But people's brains all work differently, you know, like there are creative people, for instance, whose brains I couldn't possibly seem to understand. There are all kinds of interest, you know, this goes back to my point earlier, just think the way that you're going to think. And I think, you know, lawyers will think differently from doctors, who will think differently from teachers, who will think differently from footballers. I think there are all kinds of different ways of doing it. As someone who writes books, like my job is to organize large amounts of information and structure it in a coherent way. So that naturally makes my brain try to work in that way. But if that's not your job, that's not the way your brain will work.
Very thoughtful answer. Thank you, Jamie, for your time, for sharing your wisdom and experience. I've really enjoyed the conversation and learning from you, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers have learned so much. As I say, I can't wait to share this conversation with people, and can't wait to also see what you write next and where you go on from here. So really appreciate it.
Cheers, Alan. Thanks for having me.
This educational content is absolutely free. Why? Because our vision is a world where anybody, no matter their background, can learn how to make a difference. To keep going, we need your help. Can you become our next patron? Can you help us reach 2,500 patrons? I really hope so. Whatever the case, hope you learned something today, and sending you peace and love. Let's keep learning.